the rain. I know rain usually is a deterrent. What we're going to do with what we are going to do with our evening. So thank you so much. I want to give some big thank yous for you being here. This means so much to me to have so many friends here in the audience and new faces. If you're a new face and I'm a new face to you, please make sure that you and I meet before the night is over. Another big thank you to Antioch Church for allowing us to host this here this evening and really just championing the topic of Generation Z. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Antioch. So I spent about 10 years of my professional life working with millennials. I worked at a university out in Oklahoma. It was a Christian university. And when I worked out there, I kind of, for the whole 10 years, really worked in mentorship, kind of a little bit of a pastoral counseling-like capacity, and dealt with a wide range of issues from I'm homesick, I'm having suicidal ideations or suicidal thoughts, to I have substance abuse issues, and even down to I don't know how to talk to that cute girl in the cafeteria. Those were easier to solve. The last one was I would just tell the guy, go up to her, start marching around her. When she says, "What are you doing?" say, "Well, I'm just marching around you till the walls to your lonely heart fall." You're like, look at you and they're like, "That works?" I'm like, "No, just make sure I'm there when you do it." That's all I want. So dealing with a whole host of issues with millennials and actually seeing where we are at with Gen Z growing in those kind of early years. I befriended a student at the university that I worked at. His name's Daniel. And I'm up in the cafeteria one day, and I see Daniel from across the room, and he's got a pair of glasses on. And one, I didn't know Daniel wore glasses to begin with, so I see Daniel, like, "Daniel, those glasses look great." He's like, "Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it." And as I'm walking closer, I realize that there's no lenses in the frames. Daniel, why are you wearing glasses without lenses in them? "Well, Aaron, I want to look hip and trendy. It's the cool thing." And so Daniel wanted people to view him through the lens of, no pun intended since there were no lenses in his frames, he wanted people to view him through the lens that he was hip and cool. Now I know all the cool kids don't say hip and cool anymore, but that's how he wanted to be viewed. And I think that when it comes to Generation Z, we put glasses on. Now, some of us who are fortunate enough as sighted persons who don't have to pay to see the rest of the world, joke went over better in my head earlier. If we wear glasses, we wear them to correct a challenge with our eyes. Maybe it's a stigma, or maybe we just need to magnify something. But what we really want is to be able to see the world the way that everybody else sees the world. We want to see the world as it is. And so tonight, as we talk about Generation Z, that's what we want to do. We want to see their world as the way that it is. And then we can figure out where we can help and where maybe we're not needed. So, Generation Z is a really interesting dynamic. And a lot of people want to think that Generation Z is very unique, that we've never seen them ever before. And that's not really quite the case. And we'll get into that just a little bit more. Generation Z is unique in the sense that they really buck all of the trends that have been developing since the 1970s. One of the crazier trends that unfortunately has been bucked is the issue of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. So in the 1980s, when America started tracking these statistics, it started up here and it began declining throughout the decades until we get to about 2015. And in 2015, things radically changed. All the gains we made as a society went out the window. everything spiked way up. On our college campuses, something crazy began to happen as well. One, we saw students doing the right thing and reporting that they had mental health concerns or challenges, and that's a good thing. That's what everybody should do. But we also saw young people who were unable to really have healthy conversations. There's a video, if you go on YouTube, Google it, write in the name Erica Christakis, you will see a very talented PhD in education, her husband specifically in this one video I'm thinking of, and he is surrounded by a group of students like it is a mob. And they are screaming and yelling at him. And because his wife sent an email and said, I think more young people should make decisions on their own. For whatever reason, the email went to everybody on campus instead of just the administrators. And students began to become very concerned, terrified, afraid, so afraid that they felt the appropriate thing to do was to circle her husband like a mob and begin screaming and yelling at him, that it was his job to make them feel safe and at home on the campus of Yale University. Now, that's a really weird thought because I think many of us, if we've gone to college, we never thought of college as home. Like, oh, that box that I live in, that's great. It's not really like home away from home. But to understand how we got here with Gen Z, how they became what we consider fragile and difficult to reason with and talk to, and to have higher rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicide. These things did not happen overnight. And actually, they happened over several generations. So actually what has happened in American history, or the American experience as I like to call it, we have actually experienced something called a cycle or a series of cycles. And these cycles have repeated themselves over and over for at least 5 times. And as in this American experience, we actually live in the 5th cycle, and we actually live at the end of this 5th cycle. The first cycle began with the Puritans landing in America, and we call it the Puritan cycle. And then the next cycle is the Revolutionary cycle, and as you can guess, that has to do with the Revolutionary War. The cycle after that is the Civil War cycle. Next cycle is the Great Power cycle, and that deals with the Great Depression and World War II. And finally, we land here in the Millennial cycle. And this is where we're at. It started in 1946, right after World War II, and it has been going up until just about now. There's 2 major events that happen in a cycle. One is called an awakening, and the other is called a crisis. Now, the awakening happens in the middle of these cycles, and these cycles work in about 80-year cycles. And in that awakening cycle, it's called the Boomer Awakening. Now, yes, it's named after the baby boomers. The baby boomers had a prolific impact on that awakening. They had a prolific impact on that awakening. But typically what happens with an awakening is very spiritual. It's where our society wants to turn and look in. And they want to know what's going on in my world. Am I spiritual? Now the crisis is a little different. By the time we get to the crisis, our outlook is no longer inside, it's actually outside. And we say that the world isn't working correctly. And so we need to make the world match what we're thinking in our heads, our ideologies, our values. And we'll go into a little bit more detail here in a second of how that works. So like I said, in 1946 starts a new cycle. It's called an American high. And in this American high, everybody's excited, everybody's exuberant, the economy is picked up from the Great Depression, and let the good times roll. 20 years later, we end up in this awakening, this Boomer awakening, and people have said, maybe I've been too comfortable. Maybe I've been too happy. I don't want to have all this material wealth. I want things to change. So in the awakening, we see baby boomers who are taking this inward focus, and as they take this inward focus, they're experiencing Woodstock, Kent State, campus social unrest, psychedelics, New Age theology, if we can call it theology, or New Age spirituality. And we also see the Jesus movement happening in this span from about 1965 to 1980. And when we get to 1980, we've got something called a third turning or unraveling. And again, it's the nature of these cycles to push against each other and to say, no, you're wrong, we're going to fix these things. And so I think a great example of the unraveling is Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority that he formed in 1981. And in this forming, what is he doing? He's trying to build a bloc, a coalition, a political force to try and undo everything that happened in the Great Awakening. And so this lasted until about 2005, this third unraveling. And when we arrive in 2005, we end up with a crisis. Now, Generation Z is born in 1995, 1997. That means that they are 10 when the crisis begins. When they turn 12, they get smartphones. They have access to social media. All the information and technology of the world is in their hands. No other generation has had that kind of access or power. They also go through something called the financial crisis of 2008. And that was brutal. It was hard. And it begins to shape who they are. And then finally in the crisis, because crises deal with, we're fighting physical wars, but we're fighting wars of ideas. And so we see this war taking place all the time around us today because we're in the middle of this crisis. And in this crisis, we could list off stuff all night about what is going on. But we have probably the most divided legislature that we've had in 80 years. We are fighting over questions of when is a person a person? When is it okay to end a life? When are these things okay? And there's no middle ground to these things. And I would probably argue there shouldn't be any middle ground to these arguments. We are questioning what does sexuality and identity look like in this crisis. We're fighting over these things. And what ends up happening is you've got a very young generation, Generation Z, that's growing up in this crisis. And they're being shaped by the crisis. And they're different than other American landscape because about 40% of them, they're not white, they're not African American, they're not Latino, they're not Asian. 40% of them are a mix of any of those ethnicities. They're very different. So Generation Z has a lot that they are exposed to. Think about Generation Z went to college in 2015. In 2015, we constitutionalized gay marriage. It's not weird for them. There's not a time that they really remember when gay marriage wasn't a thing. For them, gay marriage started in 2002, 2003 with Massachusetts. So they've always grown up with this normalization. And so what we have to look at is we have to look at how are these things shaping this generation. And a lot of it begins in that awakening with our baby boomer, my parents, for some grandparents, and to help me unpack more of what started in that awakening, I'm going to ask Dr. Jeff Myers to come on up. How's it going, Dr. Jeff?
It's great, thank you. Good. Thanks for having me over here tonight.
I'm so glad we get to do this. We never got to do anything like this before.
We never got to do this, but you have a lot of friends who are here.
They are good friends.
I think it just shows how much you invest in the lives of people that they wanted to come out and be a part of this tonight. So I'm happy to be a part of it as well.
Thank you. I appreciate you. Awesome. Well, Dr. Jeff is going to help us unpack the New Age worldview. And like I said, in that Boomer Awakening is when New Age kind of started to, not so much began, but started to get a foothold in the fabric of America. Now, what is interesting, and this may shock you, I hope it does, honestly, is that 2 out of 3 Christians who attend church hold some New Age belief. And that goes as far as not just believing something like, oh yeah, our spirits are made of energy or light or something like that. It goes as far as actively using tarot cards, practicing something Wiccan, like worshiping trees, even involves astrology, things like that. And so the New Age worldview has really infiltrated our church. And I love in your book, Secret Battles, where you talk about viruses. And that's what I think of when I think of the New Age worldview. And so my first question that I'd love to ask you is, New Age seems to serve as a giant trip to the supermarket to pull off the shelves what we like about religion and avoid what we dislike. Where do New Age ideas come from?
Aaron, thank you for the question, and it's interesting. Our study that we did with the Barna Research Group found the same thing, that most Christians strongly agree with the law of karma. They strongly agree that God is a force, not a person. I mean, these things that you just think, how could that have ever gotten into the minds and the hearts of believers? But the backdrop of this is the secularization of the United States of America, which came on the heels of the Enlightenment. The secular worldview says only the material world exists. There is no spirit, there's no God, there's no Jesus, there's no heaven, no hell, no angels, no demons. All of that stuff is made up. Okay? Only the material world exists. And then you have people coming along saying, well, maybe it's exactly the opposite of that, right? So this is the counterpoint. So what I call new spirituality, and there are different terms for it: new spirituality, New Age, higher consciousness, different things like that. But it actually takes the opposite viewpoint, that it's not where the secularist says only the material world exists, the spiritual world is an illusion. The new spiritualist says the spiritual world is what really exists, the physical world is an illusion. And the temptation for Christians in the church goes way, way back. I think it goes all the way back to an early ancient heresy called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was the idea that there's more than one God. Okay, there's a good God who's sort of the God of everything that's out there, and then there's a demiurge, a bad God who created this world. So the goal of life is to escape this world and then reunite with God, the real, true, good God who is out there someplace. And it leaks into our songs. I mean, every time we sing songs about, this world has nothing for me, that kind of a thing, you see this worldview leaking back in a little bit to say what really matters, what's really important is spiritual, not material.
Wow.
And this is something that, the early church fathers dealt with this, but you know how they dealt with it? They wrote the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. Look at the Apostles' Creed, and it is a line-by-line refutation of the Gnostic doctrine, that Jesus came in the flesh to earth, to a world that God actually created. And I think somehow in this period in history, people are really tempted to just say, look, my world's not working out that great. It hurts. My job's not all that satisfying. I'm not finding all of these. So the real truth, the real satisfaction must be out there someplace.
Wow. So let me follow up that question with, I was having a conversation, who's an acquaintance. He's a Hindu priest up in Castle Rock. And while he and I were talking, he said something that I found very interesting. He said, Westerners, those of us who live in America, we don't really understand how Eastern thought works. That Easterners just think of the world completely different the way that we do. And when he said it got me thinking that maybe that's why Eastern religion and the New Age looks so much different over here than it does in like in India or Southeast Asia. And I was wondering if you could just speak into that a little bit, like maybe who are some of the key figures that kind of drive this ideology.
Well, if you look on the list of the top 10 spiritual teachers in our age, you would have people like Rick Warren would be on the list, Joe Osteen would be on the list, but several of the main characters on that list are Oprah Winfrey, Eckhart Tolle, Deepak Chopra, and these are people who teach. They take that basic idea that the spiritual world is what really exists. The material world is an illusion, and they build their entire perspective on that. But then again, it's individualistic. But America's individualistic. I think one of the early movements in America was the transcendentalist movement, which was you understand truth not by looking outside of yourself, but by looking inside of yourself.
Yes.
Through personal introspection, you're going to find the truth. It's just as individualistic as anything else, but it's inward focused rather than outward focused. And things like that happen in a nation. A nation doesn't escape that sort of heritage, even if it goes on generation after generation after generation. So we believe that everything is individualistic. You go to church, you don't hear about the body of Christ as much as you hear about, do you have Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, right? This is about you going to heaven when you die. And a lot of people are saying these days, well, if it's about me, then why should I be there? Because it would be a lot more fun to be with myself boating than to be with myself sitting in church. Right? Well, it's actually Colorado. It's not that fun to boat here, but you get the basic idea. And I wonder sometimes that's sort of the space that I'm really trying to reflect on right now with the students I work with. And they don't have this sense that, when I was growing up, Ouija boards and things like that, boy, it's all scary stuff, stay away from that. You'd see a movie and it'd be really scary. I saw one of the Amityville horror movies with a friend when I was in high school. I think it is literally the last horror movie I've ever seen. I was so scared. We prayed all the way home. We were not praying boys, I can tell you. We were just scared to death. So I sort of withdrew from all of that, wanting to seek out spiritual things. But many of the students we work with today, they don't even necessarily see that as bad. The idea that they could conjure up something that's really real and that could really hurt them never occurs to them.
So that leads me to my last question. And as we said, 2 out of 3 Christians in the church, they hold some New Age worldview. New Age is so powerful that 1 out of 5 atheists hold some type of New Age worldview, which I think is astounding. But one thing I love about Summit is that you guys really focus on like purpose and truth and relationships. So what do you think are some key takeaways for Generation Z when it comes to truth, relationship, and this generation?
Well, I think you do have to teach truth in the context of a relationship. You have to show that my students are asking questions like, are you a good person? Do you have my best interests at heart? Can you help me grow? Can I trust you? And they are, at Summit now, we tell people, you hear about safe spaces on campus, for example. We tell them, we want our students to feel safe, to think, not safe from having to think.
Absolutely.
And that, I think that is a pretty critical difference. Other things that we're seeing happen with Gen Z, it's a lot of fun. I mean, it's a neurotic generation, but they're so much fun. I'm having more fun with the students that we work with now than I ever have, because they seem much more open-hearted. They're a whole lot less likely to get in trouble, which makes it a lot easier on staff of our program. But I think we're finding the big question I'm asking at Summit with the students is, what are the barriers that would stop you personally from living a life that's fully committed to Jesus? And we let that question hang all throughout the 2 weeks. Whereas in the old days, I would ask a question like that and then invite people to come forward to pray or to pray with their counselor, to just identify those barriers and just go to battle against them in prayer. We might have 5, 10, 15 students out of a couple hundred. Now I will have 75 to 150 out of 200 who will go for prayer because they know they need to connect with something bigger than themselves. They know it's not true that they are the center of reality, which is what everything in the culture tells them and the way their parents treat them. But that they're wanting that connection with something bigger. And what we're praying, and we really spend a lot of time on this, we have pastors come over and we have a whole session on what is church? Why should you be part of church? Why should you be part of the body of Christ? Because in the me and Jesus equation, it's the me that's the problem.
Yeah. Me plus Jesus is not, doesn't equal Jesus.
Right.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Dr. Jeff, thank you so much for taking time out this evening.
Absolutely.
And it's such a pleasure to have authors, or an author that wrote one of my favorite books is a guy named Voltaire. And he wrote a book entitled Candide. And I don't speak French, so you can all correct me later on how that is supposed to be pronounced. But he wrote this book, Candide, but he has a quote. And Voltaire was a devout humanist, devout atheist. And in this quote he said, "There is no God, but don't tell my servant lest he murder me in the night." And this raises a serious question that what happens when you remove God from the equation, or any deity? We have built our civilizations for the last several thousand years on the idea that someone bigger than us is handing us truth and asking us to live by it. So, about 16.5 million Gen Z agree that what is morally right and wrong changes over time based on society. So society, as whims and desires change, that changes truth. 1 in 4 strongly agree what is morally right or wrong depends on what individuals believe. And some Christians believe that truth with a capital T is simply oppression. That you're simply oppressing people when you tell them that truth, that there is only absolute truth. So I want to welcome our next guest, Sarah Stonestreet. Give a big round of applause for Sarah. And she is going to help us unpack the postmodern worldview that had really gained steam in the 1980s in that third unraveling, but started a little bit sooner than that. And Sarah, I know I'm not supposed to say this.
Go for it.
But you're my preferred Stonestreet.
Where's John?
Don't make eye contact.
You mark that.
Well, just jumping right out of the gate, postmodernism is one of the most difficult subjects out there. I'll read books about it and I'm like, yeah, I have no idea what I just read. There's a guy named Ihab Hassan, and he is an expert on postmodernism, and he writes this: "I know less about postmodernism today than I did 30 years ago when I began to write about it." That's problematic. I mean, you know less about it today than 30 years ago. So, since there's no agreement, I want to give you the impossible task, because I know you can do it, is tackling what is postmodernism. Can you help us understand what it is?
Well, first of all, I appreciate your confidence. And we're going to jump right into it. Because, I've thought about this for 30 years. Just written some books. No. But it is hard to nail down. But there are some characteristics that I think will help us frame the conversation and also help us identify where we're seeing postmodernism. And so I'll just jump right into those. One is what Jean-Francois Lyotard. I'll tell you more French later, but he was he called it incredulity towards meta-narrative. And incredulity meaning disbelief, meta-narrative meaning a sweeping narrative that defines and describes the human condition.
So like the big story of humanity.
The big story. He says, nope, there's no big story. So without big story, you have no foundation for truth.
Okay.
Okay, so the incredulity towards meta-narrative. And in fact, postmodernists are suspicious of anyone that's offering a big story because they view that as a control mechanism. That anybody with a meta-narrative is actually just trying to control the weak. It's the powerful writing the story so they can control the weak.
So,
Go.
So this would even apply to the Bible in the sense because the Bible is a big story.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
a meta-narrative from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm.
So, any thoughts on like the power dynamics of what Scripture brings and why they want to reject that?
Yeah, well, it is if from their lenses, it's a whole story of oppressors oppressing the oppressed, And so they want to reject that. Plus it says there's a truth, and they're saying, no, there's no truth. And so some implications of this, since there is no big story, and story is directly connected with identity, we're lost on our identity if we buy into this. And so we're left to latch on to small stories to create our identity. And so you see this and back to the oppressor and the oppressed. So that's kind of the narrative in all these stories. So some examples in culture would be, like 2 examples would be identity politics, where we group together based on our perceived identity or oppression. Or transgenderism, which is going down even to the core of male and female and saying we even get to choose that because we're making our own identity. And then, of course, social media comes into this and provides the platform for creating our own identity, putting out to the world our own story, even though it may be totally different than the real story. But also, it gives us it exacerbates the perceived injustices and gives us a platform to escalate those quickly. Okay, so that's 1, meta-narrative. There's no meta-narrative.
Okay.
2, there's no ultimate truth.
Okay.
And there's no way to know it. It's unknowable. And they would say that we are conditioned by our race and our gender and our culture and our religion. So we are way, way too biased to be able to identify any kind of truth. Number 3 would be, do you like all my notes?
I do like all your notes.
Okay, thanks. Number 3 would be, I have no idea the questions he's going to ask me, just so you know. I just kind of took notes.
This is just all off the cuff.
This is just off the cuff.
No
Okay.
previous emails, nothing.
Okay, number 3, there is no standard for right and wrong. So there's no way to judge right and wrong. Michel Foucault was a 20th century French philosopher who said this very thing. There's no right and wrong. There's only the powerful setting norms to oppress the weak. And so he said, we need to get to the bottom of these social injustices that are happening and oppressing the weak. We need to figure out what these norms are and do away with them. And towards the end of his life, he veered his attention towards sexual norms. And he said, you know what, let's do away with those too. And so in his pursuit of his own freedom, in undoing sexual norms, he actually contracted and died from AIDS.
Wow.
So I have an appropriate quote for right now. Flannery O'Connor was a Catholic Southern author in the 20th century, mid-20th century. And she said, the Catholic novelist thinks that you, wait, let me get the wording right. The Catholic novelist believes that you destroy your freedom by sin, but the modern reader believes you gain it in that very way. I feel like that applies to some of the things, some of these throwing off of norms.
Yeah.
Thinking you're actually gaining freedom, you are actually forging your own fetters, which I can't remember who said that, but it wasn't my saying. But here's the thing. is that the 20th century was a brutal century. I mean, it promised all these things at the beginning, promised progress, it promised more advancement. In some cases, in some thinking, it promised utopia. And it was a century of great improvement in technology and science and math, but it was also brutal. It was the bloodiest century, and we've all heard that. And so about mid-century, when World War I and World War II are done, and people are like, hold up, like those promises aren't quite adding up, then skepticism took deep root, especially in Western civilization. And so that plays out on a popular level, and it plays out on a philosophical level. And so the average American that holds the postmodernist view doesn't sit around and read Of Grammatology by Derrida, or do you have that on your nightstand?
It's on my Kindle.
Oh, okay. Or like think about Michel Foucault's ponderings. But what has happened is that those philosophies, as John says, have grown legs and walked into culture. That John's my husband, John Spencer. I taught him everything he needs to know about this topic. Totally kidding. But anyway, so they've walked into our culture, they've dominated. And so there's this, okay, to quote John one more time, he calls it a cultural mood. There's like our culture has this postmodernist mood, this skepticism, and it's permeated our culture. And so anyway, it's on a popular and a philosophical level.
Wow. I think, so going into our next question, kind of the quote that you gave from John, his philosophy has grown legs and walked into culture. Like you said, nobody's sitting around reading the great minds of postmodernism, but what we see is how over time these ideas creep into our everyday life. We don't need to, we don't need to have the book dog-eared, or we don't need to oh, that's postmodern. Like, we're not that aware of it as a society. And part of that, so we look at Gen Z, and 1 out of 3 say, sincerely believing something makes it true. Sincerely believing something makes it true. And I think a lot of us would respond and say, that's absurd. Like, I've sincerely believed a lot of things and failed my math test. I mean, I thought I had that one under control. I'm obviously not bitter about that math test. But, how is this statement postmodernism? When a Gen Z person says sincerely believing something makes it true.
Yeah. Well, it's postmodernist because, first of all, it assumes there's not a big truth. There's not something that we can root truth in. And so truth is whatever you believe. Great. That's great for you, And it's based on interpretation, which we can talk about Derrida too if you want. But it's based on interpretation and experience of the individual. And then the other thing is the implications that has on morality are pretty huge.
Yeah.
Because you think we're kind of forced to go, if everybody's truth looks different, then we're either forced to go into little isolated small stories. Okay. Like, well, I'll just live my way, you live your way. Or it becomes a power struggle of, well, whose story's more powerful? Right. And they're the ones that win. But here's the thing about the small stories. You may think you can stay in your little small story, but your little small story and your little small truth is going to inevitably bump with someone else's that's going to be different. And so then that's where it becomes the power struggle. And we see this especially with sexual freedom in America right now, and in Western culture right now, because there's no way that we could have the sexual freedom that we have without bumping into each other. Well, I didn't mean that like that.
The eyes in my heart got really big. I kept a straight face
you did
after you said it.
Sorry. Get your mind out of the gutter, goodness. Okay, let me rephrase that. But sexual freedom that we're living in right now in our culture the government has to step in and restrict freedom on other people. It just doesn't work because that just doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're seeing in this secular crisis that we're in this crisis that we're in today, is that we're looking outside and we have to look to government institutions to legislate morality. And that's what that's what our society is asking them to do right now, is let's pass a law. Let's do this. Let's make sure our truth, whatever we collectively, as much power as we can get, make everybody else follow it. And so, Sarah, last question. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
That was a statement, that wasn't a question.
Oh, okay.
I just want to make sure. 2 out of 3 Gen Z believe it is not morally wrong to lie. Now, I find that astounding, concerning, disconcerting. What effect do you think postmodernism has on their relationships? Like, if it's not morally wrong to lie, how does that affect their relationships? And then, do you think that Gen Z can have authentic relationships if there's no mooring for truth, no foundation for truth?
Well, first of all, that is a problem that has permeated our culture for a long time.
Yeah.
So Gen Z inherited this problem. They didn't cause it.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely.
So it's true, but it's not necessarily particular to them, you know. But how is that wait, can you say that question one more time?
I sure
Sorry.
can.
The second part of it.
Can people have authentic relationships if there's no absolute truth?
Okay. Well, I would say that throughout history, we've all, as Christians and as cultures, we've always had to look and discern what are the lies our culture is believing and what are the idols that they're trying to replace God with. And so this is a roundabout answer. Okay, I'm coming back to that. But I think that in each generation, God has raised people that are able to speak truth and have authentic relationships, and in those relationships, be able to speak truth and lead their contemporaries to the truth that brings life. And so I'm kind of excited about the posture that we're in, because you mentioned crisis, like we're in a crisis. And back to Flannery O'Connor, she would say, people accused her of writing grotesque and violent, like she has violence in her book, which is true, but not the grotesque part, but the violence. But she said, violence is never an end for a good writer, but it's often in violence that grace is offered and a choice has to be made. And I think the same is true in crisis.
Absolutely true.
That grace is offered. And I feel like that's the posture as Christians that we're in. We're in a posture to influence, because here we have a culture that's so confused, that's even confused about the fundamentals of male and female. Like, if we can go that confused, their identity is so off, that here we are. We have a big story that is life-giving, and it is true. And so I'm excited about this generation, because I think that through authentic relationships, and what Dr. Myers was saying about having authentic relationships is really important to this generation. And so we can't just give them facts. They get facts all day long through social media and all that, but we can have a conversation and we can speak to them in that way. So I'm excited, because I think this next generation is poised to influence. And I'm excited to see how that happens. And so one thing I'm really concerned about with my own kids and with the kids that I interact with, their friends, and in classes that I teach, is that they learn truth, but they also learn how to communicate in a winsome way. Because if you know truth and can't communicate it, okay,
Right.
what do you do? But if you can communicate it, boy, that influence is going to be to their neighbor, to their friends, to their institutions, to culture ultimately. So I'm excited to see where this crisis leads us, because I think it's a moment of grace.
I agree with you 100%. Let's give a big round of applause. earlier, the topic of eugenics, pro-life, pro-abortion, this topic is one of the most divisive topics that we find ourselves in this crisis. And we find 7 out of 10 Generation Z, they believe that abortion is acceptable. And abortion is it's not a new battle. It's not a conversation from the 1970s. A lot of this actually began in the 1900s in America. And in the 1900s, we had figures like Margaret Sanger and others who wanted to practice something called eugenics. And I'm inviting our friend Megan Allman. She's with the, oh gosh, I just blanked out on the Life Training Institute. And she is going to come up and we're going to talk about eugenics a little bit more. Please give a big round of applause for Megan Allman.
Gosh, I still have nightmares about my geometry teacher making the whole class look at me and say, will someone please explain to Megan why because I said so is not a good enough proof for this geometry problem. It was like 2 a.m. homework that night.
I gave a speech in college, and we had to have like a credibility, like we had to give some credibility, and I said, and I'm Aaron Brown, and that's good enough. And then I passed, so that's what's important. So Megan, you are obviously well versed in the topic of pro-life and apologetics. Eugenics is truly a larger subject than solely abortion. Do you think that you could give us a brief overview of what eugenics is?
Yeah, sure. And anytime I talk about the topic of abortion too, I tell people that in order to properly really talk about it, you have to dig up underneath it and see what's going on. So when we do that, we find the common ground, because I would say it's a purview of eugenics. Underneath abortion is kind of this lurking idea that's been around for a very long time, and it is the assumption that there are some human beings who matter more than other human beings. It's not a new idea. You could do a brief glance of history to see the way that it's manifested in societies prior to ours, but when we look at eugenics, we're seeing kind of the same idea taking place, if we would look up underneath it. Because each of the worldviews that we've mentioned tonight has an accompanying anthropology or an explanation of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And that idea strikes at the heart of that. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be valuable? Who counts and who gets to decide that? So eugenics, it has been around for a long time. We can look as far back for the idea as Plato, when he wrote about it in the Republic. But the word didn't really come around till late 19th century. Sir Francis Galton was the one who wrote it in a book of his. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and they shared more than just blood. They shared worldview ideas as well. So the main idea behind it was this kind of this hope that we could kind of harness humanity and create something better from it, or cleanse it in some way and get rid of things like disease and sickness, but also these unwanted traits or these things that were considered less than. And so in the early 20th century in America, that came about through things like sterilization. I remember the court case, Buckford versus Bell was one that happened in like 1927, I think it was, involved a young girl who was sterilized, and once that was passed, there were around 70,000 who followed that. So it was kind of crazy things happening. Eugenics is most widely known when we think about people like Hitler in World War II and the Nazis, who were trying to take this idea to its extreme, of course, and kill off individuals who possess these arbitrary, unwanted traits, in this case being Jewish or being disabled. So the idea there manifested in such a way that 11 million people lost their lives. So after World War II, it really kind of lost momentum in talking about it overtly. But it's still very present today in things like you were describing with abortion. It really has to do with the technologies that we have, and the desire to kind of make humanity better and have this ideal human existence, as it were. And really a lot of that has to do with kind of taking control of procreative material and reproductive material.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for unpacking that for us. Over the decades, and we're kind of saying it right now, these ideas of eugenics kind of creep and kind of keep going. even to the point today where we argue, well, when is a person a person?
Yeah.
Are there some other areas of eugenics where we've seen this creep throughout the past few decades?
Absolutely, and we can really pick up from really Jeff and Sarah's talks on the two worldviews we looked at. Jeff was talking about kind of post-enlightenment and the secularism that came in. Francis Schaeffer would have called that the fact-value split that happened within secularism. So secularism itself split in two. Bottom rung there is what we had is people who kind of considered science the basis of all that is real. These were your materialists. And then the top rung were those who reacted to that and said, no, can't stand that world, don't want to live in that world. So they made values the basis of all that is real. But they bought the premise that came out of the Enlightenment, which is values are subjective. So we have some who would see humanity as purely materialistic, these anthropologies again. Human beings are just stuff, just physical, which kind of creates some crazy issues when you think about if I'm nothing more than my physical parts and there's no real dignity or underlying immaterial self to me, then what's the big deal about experimentation or trying to better or manipulate? With those who would hold values as the basis of all that is real, that even came about in a way, especially with abortion and what we see here. My values are the basis of what is real, so I can define reality in different ways, even going so far as to rewrite biological reality.
Right.
And so, yes, what we see from those anthropologies, both of which are kind of driving the discourse today, not the Christian anthropology, but those, are things like abortion. Abortion, of course, now that we have the ability to do prenatal testing and prenatal diagnosis and find these diseases, the idea coming about of when we want to rid the world of disease, but the answer to that right now is to rid the world of the individual who carries the disease. We can take that as far back as artificial reproductive technologies, where we have pre-implantation screening and pre-implantation diagnosis, looking for faulty embryos who are human beings, who are then discarded through selective termination, which is abortion. And then we can go as far as looking at genetic testing, where we're looking for these genetic markers, these problems that people may or may not have. Now, there is some good in that, because what if we did have the ability to cure some diseases, things like cystic fibrosis and things that we found to be purely genetic? That would be wonderful, but technology always comes with unintended consequences. And when driven by worldview, we can see crazy things can happen, such as with reproductive technologies, children begin to look like commodities. Things that we can put together and piece together. We can look at the other end of the spectrum, things like euthanasia, which comes from that view of if we're going to define what a person is based on values, or if they're no longer of use to us, then of course the idea being they're a drain on society at the end of life, and we can therefore kill them. It has just the things that these truths are communicating to people in the disabled community. So the front end, the beginning of life issues like Down syndrome. And then the end of life issues, those who begin to take that language of right to die and begin to see it as a duty to die. It's really, really terrible. But
what was the movie that came out a few years ago? It involved, I think the story went that it was a guy who was kind of playboy, was driving his car really fast.
Me Before You.
Me Before You. And my understanding is he was paralyzed from the neck down, and the movie for the most part is about trying to figure out his life and getting a sense of his life back.
Yeah.
But at the very end, spoiler alert, he chooses to end his life, and that had a very big backlash with the disabled community, because they felt the movie communicated that their lives, like you said, duty to die instead of a right to life in that instance.
Yeah, there's a lot that feeds into that. Master of my own destiny, autonomous individuals. Then at the end of that spectrum that I was mentioning, we have also the transhumanist movement, who takes this whole idea of trying to make humanity better by surpassing human nature altogether. So all these ideas feeding in, and we can do a whole lot, but should we? Comes back to that question.
Just because you can, should you? Last question for the night. So 1 out of 3 Gen Z believe abortion is wrong, which means 2 out of of 3 Gen Z believe abortion is fine. You are boots on the ground. You are in high schools frequently and meeting with people and working with different groups. In your experience, what has been one of the most helpful tools that you have used to help young people see the sacredness of life?
Yeah. Well, just a word about the young people that I work with, and similar to, I think, Jeff and Sarah, I've had very similar experience with them. They are hugely energetic. They are compassionate. They have exposure to what's going on all around the world. They want to solve problems. Like young people I talk to talking about wanting to dig wells in Africa. When I was younger, I don't think I was even thinking about how to help my next door neighbor, which doesn't say a lot about me. But so they're interesting to work with in that way and exciting to work with in that way. And I think in a lot of ways, because of things being so up in the air with these worldviews that they're kind of inundated with, they really just want something that is grounded. When it comes to the abortion issue in particular, and all the others we mentioned could be related back to this.
Yeah.
Moral relativism, coming particularly from the postmodern worldview, the idea we don't ground morality in anything like Sarah was talking about, that's a huge stumbling block with abortion in particular, with these issues in particular. I think there are reasons for that, but sometimes just pointing out to the students that I'm working with that we think this way about abortion, but we don't think this way about other issues where that idea, some human beings matter more than others, is at play and causing injustice. And these are issues they deeply care about and should. Racism, sex trafficking, slavery around the world, women's rights globally, all these different things kind of play off of that idea manifesting in ways. But with abortion, it's, oh no, that's your truth. So I sometimes will give them the example. There's a bumper sticker that exists that says, oh, you don't like abortion, don't have one. And that's more relativistic language, as if it's a preference issue.
Right.
Francis Beckwith would say, what if that bumper sticker said, oh, you don't like slavery? Well, don't own one. Oh, you don't like spousal abuse? Well, then don't beat your spouse. Sometimes it's just making that connection to show that the kind of conversation we're about to have about abortion isn't a relativistic conversation. It's, to capital T, true.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think really reaches them, because we live in a society that values people functionally, and that's the whole driving force behind eugenics, is this, I'm going to choose an arbitrary reason to say that human beings matter, and we're going to go with that, whoever's in the position of power. I think students kind of buy into that on a day-to-day, and we all do to some degree because we all live in the same culture. When we wake up on days and we just don't feel worthy that day, maybe we're having a bad hair day, or we didn't get enough likes on Instagram, or whatever it is. It could be other things. Things aren't going well at work. You didn't perform well on a test. The sporting event that you were a part of didn't go well. You had a fight with someone. Like all these things that we try to look at and balance, like I want to matter. And these are the things that dictate that. When we're able to peel it back and show that even philosophically speaking, the best answer to the question, why are human beings valuable, is they're intrinsically valuable. That means you matter just because you're human.
And just the way you are.
That's it. So if they can grab hold of that idea, which is firmly rooted in the Christian worldview, in the Imago Dei, they have the potential to really become the kind of young people that the world can't really define. And if they can grab hold of that vision, as Sarah was talking about, if we can tell them that better story about themselves, and they can begin doing that for the others around them, they become very dangerous to this world in a good way. Because the world doesn't know what to do with people like that. I think that story, which is true of them, is, I think that's attractive to them. I think it's a beautiful story. So if they can understand that there's a better story about them than the one that they're believing, and how that fits into the larger story, then that really connects with them too. But that comes from the philosophy stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Megan. Let's give Megan a big round of applause. My first question right out of the chute is, and I saw this in your research, you referenced Michael Novak's book, The Secular Saint.
And he states, the quest for human values in our society has moved outside the church. So, somebody that has done extensive work on this, can you tell us what was happening to mainline denominations in America with words like Michael Novak's?
Yes, I can. So, as you mentioned in kind of discussing this generation theory, in the decades leading up to the 1960s, mainline Protestants, or what some historians call liberal Protestants or ecumenical Protestants, these are kind of interchangeable terms. We can use the term mainline, but sort of growing out of this longer tradition of religious liberalism in the United States that extends back to the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. They had always kind of evidenced this really profound concern for societal issues and for the development of these human values. So they've always been very outward looking in attempting to sort of address society's ills, asking, okay, how can the church address these things and transform society? A lot of this is in line with these kind of progressive political views and turns we see at the beginning of the 20th century. And this works for several decades. This is sort of the view that these sort of mainline denominations are espousing. And especially, as you mentioned, in the wake of World War II, we see this kind of global crisis. And so we see this renewed emphasis on asking questions like, okay, how does our faith inform the way we develop values in society, the way we pursue freedom? How does this help us grapple with what is the meaning of life in the wake of all this devastation and this all this war and conflict? And so they're sort of attempting to offer theologically based or kind of church-related answers to these things. But what we see in the 1960s is we see all of these kind of societal tensions escalate in a new way, not necessarily just globally, but also sort of at their front doorstep, so to speak. So we see mounting tensions with the civil rights movement. This is becoming increasingly visible. You turn on your television, and as in no time before, television's a relatively new technology. You see these things in your living room. You're sort of watching in horror as the conflict in Vietnam escalates. Cold War is looming in the background. And so for many of these mainline Protestants who, again, come from this tradition of caring about and wanting to address these social issues, for the first time, many of them are asking the question, has our approach thus far been adequate? And many of them are driven to the conclusion that if sort of these decades of trying to approach these things through maybe kind of theologically based advances in society, to many of them, these approaches of the past decades seem simply inadequate. So many of them are driven to come to the conclusion that perhaps churches themselves are unnecessary, and perhaps the answer is moving outside of the churches and simply advancing good in society. Perhaps it's religion, perhaps it's theology, perhaps it's dogma that is holding us back from sort of transforming society. Because clearly, if our approach would have been effective, we wouldn't be seeing these really kind of tumultuous conflicts in the United States and in the world.
Maybe you can help us understand belief. Like, what are we missing where we're going from there's a God, his kingdom is coming to earth, to God's probably dead. It's so we're going to pick up the mantle of bringing a kingdom to earth.
Yeah.
Can you shed some light on that for us?
Yeah, certainly. So it's funny, you mentioned sort of Nietzsche in that, because in the 1960s we see a movement arise that's called the Death of God movement. And this is quite radical. So I certainly don't want to give the impression that like the vast majority of mainline Protestants are actually subscribing to like every sort of tenet of Death of God theology. In fact, many of them sort of hold it at arm's length. But I think it's really helpful because while it is a more radical manifestation of this kind of cultural moment of these questions, I do think it's reflective of many of the concerns and questions of Americans in general, but specifically mainline Protestants, maybe liberal Protestants during this time. So yeah, it sort of contends that when Jesus died on the cross, his spirit left the earth, and so humanity is simply left. And so it's sort of, a lot of it actually draws upon and interprets the writings of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which took a couple of decades, although he was writing in the 30s and 40s, took a couple of decades to sort of make it over into kind of mainstream American theology. But they're taking his ideas of this religionless Christianity, of a world come of age, so sort of a humanity that maybe in its childhood and its infancy needed religion, needed church in order to mature and form, that it had now by the 1960s matured, and that the ultimate kind of teleological goal of human history was to outgrow the garment of religion and to outgrow the need for the church. So this is this mature man coming of age, so to speak. So often they speak of the ultimate goal of Christianity being freedom, including freedom from religion itself. And obviously this is quite radical. As I said, not everyone is subscribing to every tenet, but it addresses, for many of these mainline Protestants, sort of this tension between how do I sort of hold this faith, but also address these incredibly sort of pressing social issues. And it's a theology that lends itself very well to sort of social activism, which is why I think it gains kind of such a foothold during this cultural moment. So we may have many who aren't fully subscribing to this, but who do are sort of very receptive to this idea that the church and the church's dogma and teaching may not be necessary to be the church in the world.
That is amazing. I'm so glad Jesus came to deliver us from Jesus.
It's a little extreme. And I should mention too, this is a departure for these liberal Protestants, because this stream of kind of liberal Protestantism until this time sort of stood as a middle ground between conservatism, whether that be political or theological, and radicalism. So there's actually if you want to call it a conservative streak within liberalism, in that it typically thrives within institutions, whether they be religious or political. So sort of they do have a stake in maintaining that status quo and maintaining these institutions, not radically doing away with them, but it's always thrived within these. So this is a departure that is quite radical, or you talk about that turning point in the 60s, where we see for the first time some of these liberal Protestants willing to maybe jettison their attachment to these denominations or religious institutions.
I just think it's crazy. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Just amazing. So with the diminishment of the main line, so I pulled some stats a while back, and like the Methodist Church specifically, they had a merger, had the largest numbers I think they'd ever had in 1967, maybe 1968, but it has been steadily declining over the last 50 or so years. What is maybe one positive outcome to the diminishment of mainline, and what do you think may be one negative outcome to the diminishment of mainline Christianity?
Yeah, so I hope I'm not answering this in too roundabout of a way, but this sort of gets at something that I think is positive. I think it's important that we see the diminishment of these kind of mainline denominations in context. So when we look at the numbers, it looks like the diminishment sort of happens at the exact same time that evangelicalism in the 1970s is ascending. And so it sort of, for many historians initially, it created this perception that, are these folks in the pews just fleeing these mainline denominations in mass? This kind of mass exodus to evangelical denominations. And we realize there's kind of more at play there. So one of the reasons we see this decline in number is that mainline Protestants have far lower birth rates than evangelicals. So they simply sort of aren't replacing themselves in the ways that evangelicals, who tend to be much more prolific, are sort of replacing their ranks there. And there are all these other demographics. So we see a lot more immigration after the late 1960s. So part of that is that mainline denominations are simply a smaller piece of the American religious pie. So all that to say, there are many factors at play there. But so many historians sort of stress, okay, this isn't simply the result of like this failure of mainline denominations, but the component of this that's closest to a failure that many scholars identify is the inability of liberal Protestantism to retain its young people after this kind of college young adult age, which is what I study specifically. And so what I think, if we can talk about this in terms of a good thing, I'll have to take off my objective historian hat here. But I think what this reveals is it helpfully reveals the danger of linking any type of religious or theological identity to a political movement. So we see this is what happens with many of these mainline or liberal Protestant youth, kind of college students and young adults in the 1960s. We see them slowly but surely sort of jettison any type of theological or orthodox kind of Christian identity as their unifying principle, and rather sort of rallying around these political and social causes, which isn't bad in and of itself. Like if we have a holistic faith, it should inform the way we interact with neighbors and strangers and think about politics and culture and all of these things. But again, their unifying principle and the source of their primary identity cease to be anything based in sort of religion or theology whatsoever. And so when these social movements, when these political causes crumble or explode at the end of the 1960s, there's no sort of unifying resources from which to draw, no theological resources from which to draw, no Christian identity, nothing that makes their Christianity distinctive in any way from maybe the nonprofit down the street or the other activist down the street. So they've sort of jettisoned any Christian distinctiveness whatsoever. And so while this is maybe for many of us sort of a sad tale, I think it helpfully illustrates the importance of keeping this Christian distinctiveness apart from any type of particular political or social agenda. And that can be on the left or on the right. This sort of runs the spectrum here. And again, not that our faith doesn't inform and sometimes even drive the way we engage with these things, but it underscores the importance of maintaining this Christian distinctiveness, this theological distinctiveness from the rest of
David Galvan, up to the stage. Now, I took you on a very long journey of worldview for a very specific reason. There's a study that was done a few years ago, and what they found in that study is that if you hold the values of the worldviews we just talked about, you are less happy in life than your conservative counterparts. And if you hold these views that we just talked about, you are, what's the word I'm looking for? You actually don't like people. You are prejudiced towards people who don't hold these values. So part of the study dealt with professors in a university, and if you held these values and you saw somebody that you thought was a conservative and their name was on a grant requesting money, now I'm going to deny it because they don't hold the values that I hold. And as they did this study, they just found that the happiness levels were lower, which really brings us to where we want to be tonight on our topic of Gen Z. A couple of months ago, I had the privilege to have a conversation with a guy named James Chong. James is the Vice President of Innovation for InterVarsity, which is like a campus missions ministry here in America. And he took the idea of generations that we talked about tonight, and he looked at millennials. And he found that the driving question for millennials was the question, what is beautiful? What is beautiful? What makes life beautiful? What brings meaning to it? And so this is maybe where we see millennials are like, why do they want work-life balance? What's up with that? Why can't they just go to a job? Why do they want to work from home? What's all this remote stuff? Why are they just hopping from job to job? I'm practicing my cantankerous old man as well.
I like it. I
want to get
it's
a
a
leg
good way
up.
to come down. We're landing.
Yeah,
So
we're landing. We're landing.
No, you're
So James asked that question of millennials. And so as I've worked on this stuff, I've come to the point that the question for Generation Z is, am I safe? And I think that is the driving question for Generation Z. So when we look at worldview, if they're holding a worldview that has these values, their happiness isn't safe. We look at, another major factor with Gen Z is that they struggle with what are called snowplow parents or helicopter parents. Helicopter parents began with millennials. Snowplow just got bigger and better as we rolled into Gen Z.
Sounds about right.
And so what we find is that Gen Z who grow up with parents who do everything for them, maybe out of love and kindness, things like that. Like, I'm trying to do this to help my child. They're actually handicapping their child, much like the analogy of a butterfly.
Yes.
Larva is, trying to get out of the cocoon. It's, doing that whole thing.
Yeah.
We'll have to have a dance party later. But if you help that. If you help
after
that,
Gen Z parties later. Yeah, after Gen Z parties later.
you can DJ it.
Yeah.
Inside joke, sorry guys. But if you help that caterpillar, that butterfly is trying to get out of the cocoon, you actually weaken its wings and it can't fly when it gets out. So what we find with Gen Z is that if we do too much for them when they're working their way through that youth stage, developmental, that we actually lower what's called their self-efficacy, their confidence that they can handle life on their own. When they feel like they can't handle life on their own, their anxiety and depression goes way up. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about tonight, and really want to look to my friend David Galvan. He is the Director of Education for a Lifetime, and you are a mental health certified first responder.
First aid, yeah.
First aid responder. And so David has a wealth of knowledge and information and practicality that he can add to this conversation. And then what we're going to do is we're going to wrap everything up with some practical things that we can take home, that we can take to the youth ministry, and that we can even take to our workplaces. So David, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Well, I appreciate that. I love that I get to go after Jeff and Sarah and Megan because they get to say a lot of smart things, and I can take all those smart things and make them common. And so that's what my role is in life, and it's to take something that can be very complex and very detailed, and then say, well, what do we do with this? Like, what do we do with all this great knowledge now? And where do we go from here? And so one of the things I love about Gen Z, and it's been said over and over again, is they love to ask questions. They've been a great generation to ask questions, and they want to ask more questions. And I've heard it said this way: Gen Z doesn't need the older generation for information. They need us for interpretation. They need us to take that information and interpret that information. What does it look like? How do we interact with that? What do we do with that information? And so when you talk resiliency, most of us grew up through our life with fairly limited things that actually really, really affected us. And we came out of that, okay, a little bit unscathed, but okay, right? If we take on the mentality of helicopter parent or slow plow or lawnmower or whatever you espouse to, Humvees, whatever you do, that at the end of the day will actually remove resiliency for our children. I love, there's a book by that I love. It's titled The Gift of Failure. The gift of failure. The gift that at the end of the day, it's okay to fail. And the story that's told in there is this middle school teacher writes this book. She says, my student that day or that night had worked on a project. They're a second grader. Now they're a second grader, worked on a project, and the project is sitting on the coffee table. That project, as it's sitting on the coffee table, mom sees son go out the door, got the lunch in the bag, the backpack, and goes all the way to the bus, and mom sees project on the coffee table, sees son go out the door, project on the coffee table, in the bus, bye mom, and literally the mom left it on the table. Then the mom has this dilemma. I'm going to the school later. I gotta go talk to the school nurse anyways. I should probably just take the project with me. and has this wrestling that some of us as parents have had before, right? I have a freshman that's going to be a freshman, and this dilemma like, do I take the project? Do I not take the project? Do I take the project? I should watch a Netflix, and then I'll take the project. Like what goes on in that moment? And the parent, she said, I didn't take it. And what she said after that, she was writing the book, she said, I'd rather them learn this lesson now than when they're 18, when they're 26. And what's happened with snowplow parenting and that lawnmower parenting and helicopter parenting is we've lost resiliency, that grit that we live in that says, hey, I've got to navigate this and figure this out so that I can become that butterfly. And so what happens is we now see 1 in 5 student between the ages of 15 and 24 living with a mental health illness. Now that's diagnosed, okay? So that means there's more than that are walking around with anxiety, depression, they're walking around with bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever that looks like, and parents are ill-equipped to have those conversations. You know, we grew up in an era where, or in our city here, I should say, where we taken the sicknesses and illnesses and really have made them kind of stigmatized. And let me explain how it is. You've probably heard this if you lived in Colorado Springs anytime. You've heard, well, the weather's a little bipolar here. And in that one moment, who's ever standing around us that maybe navigating bipolar, that stigma is in. Like I can't.
A history of depression in close family members.
Maybe you say like, man,
experiences,
those people are really
such as lack of
crazy.
care,
They're like, and then all of a sudden, like
learning and other school
like,
difficulties.
no context.
How about this
What
one?
you mean
Recent
by that,
adverse
because it's
events in
okay
that
for you to
person's
say.
life, such
They
as
can
being a
put that
victim of
stigma on
crime,
the reality.
it's death,
You're not
serious
sick.
illness in the family, having
Our
an
students
accident,
deal with a
being
lot of
bullied,
distrust. How do we know
victimized.
this? Well,
How about this?
social media is
Parental
great. I love
separation
social media. I probably posted
A
something
contributing
today. You
factor.
probably posted something today.
When
That
we
was pretty
saw, I
funny.
loved how you
I was going to
compensated.
read
We saw
something in
2005.
regards to.
We got our
I just want to read
recession,
this
we
because
saw
you've been talking a lot about math.
We saw
It says,
divorce
"Dear
go up,
algebra, stop talking.
and all these
Stop
separations,
asking us
and
to
we
find
see
your
a
ex.
generation
She's
now
not coming
living
back."
more blended
And so
and this
that would have been my response in high school. And so I would say at the
having
end
a
of the
mental
day
illness,
that these students are
carrying this
navigating
one was really
seeing stuff on
interesting.
social
Caring
media
full time
more
for
than
a
any other
person with a
generation.
long-term disability.
And they're seeing traumatic
that can
events,
increase
school
the
shootings,
factors of depression.
They're seeing
On the
floods,
anxiety
being
side,
burned
something
out,
for us that I
fires,
want us to consider as we look at
They're seeing this
risk
at a-
factors for anxiety.
exacerbating level.
This
Than
is
more than any
having
other more
generation
sensitive. When we grew
emotional
up,
nature. If
when
you
I
look at our
grew up,
generation,
we would
they
see it in the
can talk about
newspaper the
their
next
emotions
day.
and the other
I read the
like more than
newspaper
any other
growing up. I
generation.
loved it. My
Most
bowl
of
of
us are
cereal,
told, don't talk
tricks,
about your
and like a
emotions,
newspaper.
right?
Like,
You
but
can't
like
feel
this
that, right? We grew up
generation
in a
will
era
see
where
the
big
school
boys
shooting
don't
happening
cry,
live
big girls don't
and
cry.
somebody recording
And
in
now,
the
like,
school.
it's okay to
I mean,
cry at
right
everything,
now.
and they're
From
like,
the phone.
oh gosh,
Raw
like how do we
footage,
do this?
uncensored.
And so we could see
On
this happen.
live.
And
what
one
a
of the risk
traumatic
factors
event
again
is
is experiencing
when
a
something
traumatic
like that happens, it's all based on perception.
And trauma is something as
It's
a
a perceived
generation
idea
that
of what
we're
just
all
happened.
still learning.
For
For
us,
instance,
to learn
right now,
what it
we
looks
do
like and how
this
this
room right
affected
now,
us.
and all of us.
And
will
so
have
what
a
I
different
encourage
perception.
people to do, especially
and all of
regards
us
to
to
Gen
feel
Z,
something different.
is
And all of a sudden,
find
all
ways
those-
to be
all
equipped
those
with information that's going to be
depression,
helpful. All those emotions.
There's a program
involved
out there
in that
called
moment. Youth mental
Our
health
students are
first
seeing
aid.
this on a regular basis.
It's much like
on their
CPR
Snapchat
feeds.
on their
It's
social
very,
media
very
feeds.
simple. It's an 8-hour
And
training.
it's not that we can
one day
sit there and
training.
like block all
But
this
you
all
go
day
through
long.
so
They're gonna
much
see it
in
at some point
regards
or
to
another.
suicide.
Their friends got a
You
phone
talk
about
about
suicide.
Did you see what
talk
happened
about
last
the
night?
traumas that they
Did you see
all
this?
these-
And then
here's
there's
what
what
I'll
I'm
bullied. And then all these other things are going on,
students
and we've
believe
got a
that
generation.
suicide's a better option than
depression,
failure.
anxiety.
That is literally their choice right now. Let me read you a couple things in regards to depression and anxiety.
I don't believe.
And
So I'll
as you
ask
think
students
about
in the
these things,
classroom.
think about a student that you know. Like, that's all I'm just going to encourage you to do. If you couldn't, if failure was available, and then think about
What would you
man,
choose?
what are they
You're like,
experiencing?
I'm out.
What are they navigating?
I'll quit.
And I just want to get us into their minds. So, risk factors
Like,
for
our generation, the failure
for
wasn't
depression.
that wasn't an option. You're like,
And these are
figure out
things
how to
that are
do this.
factors that
Let's
increase
figure out how to
a
do it.
person's
That's
risk
some
for
resilience.
depression. A history of depression
So
and
now
close
let's
family
choose
members.
suicide.
Adverse childhood experiences, such as lack
So
of care,
in our culture
or
here
abuse,
in Colorado Springs,
learning and other
2016
school
and 2017, we had 30
how
deaths
about
by
this?
suicide.
Recent adverse
in the age of
events in that
19.
person's life, such as
And
being
we
a
have
victim
what
of
we call
crime,
diffusion. They
yeah,
have different words,
serious
as
illness in the
contagion,
family,
cluster,
having an
like,
accident,
all those things are
bullied,
like
or
you can catch
victimized.
suicide.
How about this?
You can't
one?
catch
Parental
suicide
separation,
or
okay?
divorce.
But you
contribute
must be able to
talk about suicide.
When we saw, I loved how you brought
And
this
one of the
in,
things that
because
if I ever get a
2005,
an
we
individual
got our
recession,
recessions,
I
I
always
always
want
want
to
to
say,
homes,
make the
we saw
conversation about
divorce go
suicide
up,
and mental illness and all these separations, and we see a generation now
Because
living
that's
more
where
blended
students are.
families than any other
Here's how you
generation.
know if you're a
And
safe
this
place.
increases
Ask
that
them.
likelihood of
Ask
depression
students.
and anxiety and those
I've asked
things.
students in the classroom, I said, having
your
mental
homes, why do you not
illness,
talk about
and
suicide? And
caring. This one was really
Because my
interesting.
parents
Caring
think if I
full time
talk
for a
about it,
person
we'll
with a
go do it.
long-term disability.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
That
They've
can
been asking you to
increase
make
the
your beds
effects
for a
of
long
depression.
time.
On the anxiety side, something for us that I want us to consider as we look at risk factors for anxiety. One, this is having more sensitive emotional nature.
Because
you look at our
they
generation,
they make it awkward.
they can talk about their emotions,
And I'll say
like
this.
more than any other
Something
generation.
only as awkward as
Most
you
of us are told, don't talk about your emotions.
You guys do
right?
stuff
Like,
at your house.
you can't feel that, right? We grew up in a era where big
I've had to
boys
take
don't
off
cry,
shoes,
big girls don't
socks on
cry,
people's houses,
and now like it's okay to cry at everything. And like, oh my gosh, like how do we do this? And so we can
But
see
that's
this
where we're at.
one of the risk
if we
factors
can do
again is
anything,
experiencing a
be
traumatic
equipped
with the information as we talk to
And
trauma
trauma
is something as a
realize
generation
they're
that we're all
probably
still
navigating
learning.
something that I have no
We're all still
context
learning what
for.
that looks like and how it's
And
affected us.
Rather than saying,
And so
pull
what
up
I
your
encourage
boots
people to
and
do,
buckle
especially
up,
in regards to
son,
Gen Z,
say,
is
like, where are
find
you
ways
at?
to be equipped with
Let me be a
information
safe
that's going to
place to
help you
help
journey along the way.
There was a
And I'll leave
program
you
out
guys
there
with
called
this.
Because of
Youth
Faith
Mental
House.
Health
We're
First.
not leaving.
No,
It's much like
Sarah, but I'll leave you
CPR
this.
mental health.
I
It's
had a
very,
student
very
one time.
simple. It's an 8-hour training. It's a
come to
one-day
me and
training.
say, hey, I'm really
But you
navigating
go
anxiety,
through so
depression.
much
I
in
talk to my
regards to
parents.
suicide.
And I go, what have your parents said? They're like,
well, we got to
trauma
read more
with the
scripture,
all the
pray
things.
some
Here's what I'll
more. And they're like, I really want to see a counselor. They're like, but
students
I think
believe
it's
that-
just,
that
I think it's
suicide
just
is
where
a
you're
better
at right
option.
now. It's going to be okay.
That is
And this
literally
had
the choice,
transpired for weeks. And I was like, and here's what I'll encourage you. Whenever we find someone
I don't
that
believe
says,
that.
I need
So I'll
help,
ask students in the
let's
class.
figure out how to get them to
It's
that.
like, if I believe you could, if failures available, I've been all across Tanzania, Guatemala, Nicaragua. Here's what I'll tell you.
And I was like,
I love prayer, and I think Jesus
like
can.
in our generation,
if failure wasn't,
but also
that wasn't an
Jesus
option.
was
Like,
like,
let's figure out how to get through this. He says, let's just figure out how to get through
the
it.
Holy Spirit,
That's when
resilience
resilience
has been removed. So I think it's okay.
So
to
now
see
they'll
a
choose
counselor.
suicide. Like every now and then, we may need one, right? And so I
And
think
so
as
in
we
our
advocate
culture
those
here
individuals
in
and Colorado
Colorado
Springs in 2016 and
say, you know
2017,
what,
we had
as
30
adult
dental
students
students
training
students
youth
with
mental
mental
health
age of
first
18.
aid.
And we're making a whole effort here.
And
And
we
we
have
have
what
what
we
we
call
call
diffusion.
We
With
have
youth
different
pastors,
words
youth leaders, and
as
seeing
contagion,
great stuff
cluster,
happen.
and they're like, we believe
all
that
those things are like,
help our
you
students
can catch
especially
suicide
and be
You
successful.
can't catch suicide,
okay?
employees,
And
but
phenomenal
you
citizens.
must be able to talk about suicide.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's
And
good.
one of the things that
Good
if I ever get a individual discussion class, I would want to say, make the conversation about suicide and mental illness a safe place. Because that's where our students are. And here's how you know if you're a safe place. Ask them. Ask students. I've asked students in the classroom and said, at your homes, why do you not talk about suicide? And they'll say this, because my parents think if I talk about it, we'll go do it. I go, that's interesting. They've been asking you to make your beds for a long time. One. And then two, they say, because they make it awkward. And I'll say this, something's only as awkward as you make it. You guys do stuff at your houses that's super, super awkward, okay? I've had to take off shoes and like socks at people's houses, like, this is how we walk here. And like, and I'm like, this is awkward, but I'll do whatever you guys want, right? But that's where we're at. And so if we can do anything, be equipped with the information as we talk to Gen Zers to realize they're probably navigating something that I have no context for. And rather than saying, pull up your boots and buck up, son, say, like, where are you at? And let me be a safe place to help you journey along the way. And I'll leave you guys with this because of the faith context.
You're not leaving them.
No, I'm still right here, but I'll leave you this. I had a student one time come to me and say, hey, I'm really navigating anxiety, depression. I've talked to my parents. And I go, what have your parents said? They're like, well, we got to read more scripture, pray some more. And they're like, I really want to see a counselor though. They're like, but I think it's just where you're at right now. It's going to be okay. And this had transpired for weeks. And here's what I'll encourage you all in. Whenever we find someone that says, I need help, let's figure out how to get them to that. I believe in prayer, and I've seen signs, wonders, miracles. I've been all across Tanzania, Guatemala, Nicaragua. Here's what I'll tell you. I love prayer, and I think Jesus can work through that. But I also believe that Jesus left us with, he says this, the Holy Spirit, the counselor. So I think it's okay to go see a counselor. Like every now and then. We may need one, right? And so I think as we advocate those individuals and put them in position and say, you know what, as adults, we're going to be trained in youth mental health first aid. And we're making a whole effort here in Colorado Springs to do that with youth pastors and youth leaders and seeing great stuff happening. We believe that this is how we can help our students, especially this Gen Z, be successful and be employees and phenomenal citizens as they grow up.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Let's give David a big round. There are some very practical things that parents can do to decrease certain risks of anxiety, things like that. One, I think, is social media. So social media, there are actually engineers working in Silicon Valley, and they work to cause the social media to pull on oxytocin and dopamine. You're like, okay, those are big words. What's oxytocin and dopamine? Dopamine has the same effects on your body as crack cocaine. And when you're surfing the interwebs and the social media and you're getting the likes and things like that, it's like pop, pop. And you get that dopamine rush. And then the dopamine rush goes away and you get sad. And you get depressed. So you go back to the social media hoping somebody's liked. So for parents, I think one of the best things they can do is limit their children's screen time to less than 2 hours a day. I think that is a huge win if you can reduce the social media usage. Most kids are using about 5 screens at once. So if we can get it down to a screen, less than 2 hours a day, we're hashtag winning. So that's good.
That's more than winning.
That's more than winning. Oxytocin is interesting because when we set our phones down, we all struggle with this to some degree. When we set our phones down and like 10 seconds later we suddenly have this fear like, oh, I've got to check my phone. That release of oxytocin is the same thing that would affect somebody who was afraid they were about to be eaten by a lion. So when you have that fear, my phone, it has to be checked now, you're having the same fear of, I'm about to be eaten by a lion.
It's close. It's really close. That's why I got the watch. I'm good.
I can't do the watch. It drives me crazy. I just can't do it. Some other things that we have worked on, and one of those, I've worked with a guy named Dr. Philip Nelson. He's got his PhD in psychology out of Biola University out in California. And he and I have been talking about Generation Z and what is the solution? What are some practical things that parents, ministry, and businesses can do? Because one of the great things about generations is that once you understand how generations work, you can predict their behavior throughout their life stages. So today we're going to talk about, or tonight we're going to close out with talking about youth and talking about the adult stage of Generation Z, since Generation Z is entering the job market as we speak, or trying to enter the job market as we speak. So David and I are going to role play some cognitive behavioral therapy scenarios, and these are very simple things that you can incorporate into your home, your business, and your ministry. So Rachel's going to run that out to David real quick, those notes. And we never decided, am I going to be Susan or are you going to be Susan?
You're Susan.
Okay, let's
I'm the
do
parent.
it.
Here we go.
Okay. I'm not good at voices, guys. So Susan's going to have a southern accent. So.
This is going to be great. Just a little note on the workplace. You said 8% of millennials or Gen Z recently brought their parent on their first interview. So just so you know.
8%?
Yeah. They're like, that was me. We'll talk to you afterwards. Pay close attention.
Someone's like, see, Mom?
See, Mom? I
I
told you. You should have stayed up.
Why do we always assume it's Mom?
Yeah. Well, that's for part 2 of this lesson. All right, here we go.
So in this scenario, we want to identify unhelpful thinking. These are thoughts that get stuck in our head and we think about them over and over. So we want to identify unhelpful thinking.
Susan, you've been, how have you felt since you've been bullied on Snapchat?
I felt a little overwhelmed and anxious this week.
What specifically about being bullied on Snapchat triggered that feeling of anxiousness?
Well, I saw on Snapchat where Megan had invited all my friends to hang out at her house. She didn't invite me because she doesn't like me. but she invited all my friends. I'm always going to be alone.
You know, Susan, what you just said is called an automatic thought. We think these thoughts because they pop in and when triggered by something hurtful, like Megan leaving you out. As you can see, your automatic thought caused you to feel and become negative.
Now we're transitioning.
Ooh. The first thing we're going to do, I thought I heard like the page turner was happening. All right. The first thing we're going to do is write down this negative automatic thought you had. Megan left you out, and you saw it on Snapchat, and that triggered the thought, I'll always be alone.
Yeah, that's what happened.
When you saw the Snapchat, how did you feel?
I felt sad and lonely.
Susan, can you see how that thought could affect your whole day?
I can't. If I hadn't thought that thought, then I wouldn't have ended up in a bad mood.
Insane.
Insane. So, we're obviously amateur actors.
I heard one clap for us. That was awesome. That was awesome.
More than zero.
More than zero. I feel better now. I feel better now.
So with these scenarios, we just want you to be able to walk away with, when you're talking with your Gen Z, and you said something yesterday that as young as 7
Yeah.
are now exhibiting anxious behavior, anxious responses.
Yeah, they're actually showing that at the age of 7, that anxiety will introduce itself. Most are seeing that, but aren't diagnosed till well later in their life with that anxiety. So they could be 27 years old, living for 20 years with that anxiety, not realizing that. The average age for depression to be diagnosed is right around the age of 32, and that's because older individuals in their 50s and 60s, as well as youngers, that average mean right now is 32 years of age for someone to be diagnosed. Could you imagine though, someone living since they were 10, 12, 16, till they're 50, 56, that's 40 years of living with this unknown illness that they could live with.
Absolutely. Now, this next scenario is for the workplace. As Dr. Nelson and I worked through this, we came up with this idea that what would be great for corporations is to actually incorporate this type of therapy into their training program. So
It's going to work a lot better because you're Steve and I'm the leader.
Steve.
All right,
That's
here
great.
we go.
Here we go.
Steve, how have you felt working on Project X this week?
I felt a little overwhelmed and anxious this week, a lot like Susan with Snapchat.
Yeah. Is that your daughter? You look a lot like her.
Do we sound the same? Southern accent?
Yeah. Is there anything specific, part of that Project X, that triggered you to feel this anxiousness?
Yes, I came to the part where I was about to execute the social media strategy, and it was really difficult because I remembered a time with a marketing campaign failed on a different project. I'm always going to fail.
You know, Steve, that's what I call an automatic thought. When these thoughts pop up and when they're triggered, this is what is an automatic thought. As you can see, your automatic thought causes you to feel and become negative and behave negatively. Let's talk about your old campaign that you failed and talk about why it failed.
Okay. We talked about it.
Coming back. The first thing we were going to do is write down the negative automatic thought you had. You worked on a previous campaign that failed, and that triggered the thought, I'm always going to fail.
Yeah, that's what happened.
And when working on that project X, and then you had that thought come up again, how did you feel?
I really felt depressed and helpless.
Steve, can you see how that thought affected your entire day?
I can like Susan, if I hadn't thought that thought, then I wouldn't have ended up in a bad mood the rest of the day and not feeling like I could work on the project.
Insane.
So guys, we're going to skip down to one last one. We really want to do this for youth groups. And I really think that, let's see.
I'll make a comment as Aaron's doing this. One thing that we see, and sometimes you're like role playing and we're like, well, yeah, that sounds great here. One of the greatest things that we can do for anybody is to listen non-judgmentally. That's the hardest thing for us to do as parents and as leaders, because we know something and we are something, right? And so in that moment, to listen non-judgmentally to that person takes a lot of effort, because you want to give advice. And as you hear some of these things, it's not about giving advice, it's to take them and walk them through that journey of saying, what did just happen? How did that happen? Where did that come from? And how do we change your behavior going forward? And so these are things as adults and as those that lead a generation and those that lead youth, is to take the time to say, how did I hear this? What am I hearing? And what do I really want to say? And what should I not say right now? And so what we say, especially in the training, is that we want to give responses, not advice. Like, we want to give a response, not advice. Nobody wants to hear advice, right? Especially when they're hurting. They just want to hear that they're affirmed and reaffirm them during that time, and then later on find opportunities for advice or see this. And that's what this is now.
Yeah. So the last thing that we want to do is we want to talk about imagery. And I think this is fantastic for youth groups. What I'm seeing a lot come out with Gen Z as far as Christian discipleship, things like that, is just a new study guide that's coming out. It's just a new, read these scriptures, read these verses, talk about this. But I think that if we actually take our discipleship model and we just shift it a little bit, that we can help Generation Z deal with their anxiety and then not even realize that we're giving them the tools to deal with it. So I'd ask everybody, this is a little out of the blue, I'd ask everybody, please close your eyes. Please close your eyes. I can see you, so please close your eyes.
I have no lenses in right now.
Okay, so our eyes are closed. I want you to imagine that you are on a beach. Sand in your toes. You hear the ocean coming in. Hear the roar of the waves. The sun is beating down on your skin. You can feel the warmth. You breathe in the salty ocean air. A deep breath. Everybody take a deep breath. Exhale that ocean air. You look down the beach and you see Jesus. And Jesus is walking towards you. And a woman comes up to him, and you see Jesus heal her. Okay, you can open your eyes. So what Dr. Nelson and I have worked on and recommended is that we actually make our discipleship experiential through this use of imagery. Imagery actually works very well with young people, teenagers, children. But we'd add another caveat to it. So what we would say is take your scripture that you're working with them that week and make it experiential. Have them imagine themselves in it. But the second thing that we would do is, after you do that once or twice, invite your Gen Z student to participate. Have them lead the imagery. Have them contribute to it. Have them help write it. You can't go to the beach every week in small groups. So you may want to work up some different imageries, things like that. But slowly, over a year's time, without them realizing, you're actually giving them tools that help combat their anxiety and depression. And these are time-proven tools. I mean, you teach them as well.
Yeah, this gives them an opportunity to tell what's going on behind the scenes. So the moment we all closed our eyes, and I watched, I kind of observed what was going on, but the moment Aaron even said sand in your toes, people were like, oh, yeah. Some of you are great. Some of you, in the moment that he said hot beating sun, those of you that like wear 100-proof sunscreen, were like, please don't. Like, we all were experiencing that differently. And so students, when you give them the opportunity to share the story, and you get insight of what's actually going on for them, you'll hear the story like, this is what I'm thinking about right now. And then you'll understand kind of where their story's at, and that imagery provides an opportunity for a conversation later on.
Awesome. Well, everybody, thank you so much for being here tonight. We wanted to look at Gen Z through the lens of that question, am I safe? And I think that as you encounter those who are near you and around you that are Gen Z, you should be asking that question. How am I creating an environment that helps them feel safe, but also in a way that I can challenge them to move forward with their lives? Thank you so much for being here. We do plan on releasing an ebook in the next month or so. Yeah, an ebook.
Awesome.
And it's going to have almost everything that we talked about tonight in it, but it's also going to have strategies for implementing in your home, youth group, and in the workplace. So thank you so much for being here. There's many of you who are going to join us in the after party. That's going to be down at, that's going to be down at Rendezvous. We had to move it because of the rain, but you are more than welcome to join us. So thank you so much.